Welcome to the Equity Conscious Leader, a new generation equity podcast and YouTube channel where we chat with leaders about tangible system change and strategies to advance and sustain equity work in their organizations. Our conversations dive deep into the 6 dimensions of equity conscious leadership. So how do you lead with transformational system change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Let's find out on this episode of the Equity Conscious Leader with your host and educational equity leader, Dr. Jag Lathan.
Talk about identity. That is some of the work that you have dug deep into over the years.
So there is, you actually reminded me of some teaming work that I did as principal. And I think about collective efficacy and collective voice. And of course, John Hattie's, looking at all of the research, talking about how that's actually has the biggest impact in education, right? And that's the part that I don't think schools actually take the time to do, is what is our collective efficacy. And I will always say there's identity related to that. Right? Because I'm going to take elementary school. If I'm a teacher, that's one identity. If I'm a first grade teacher, that's another identity. If I'm a teacher at Sunset School, that's an identity. And so we don't actually stop and think about all of these layers of identity. Then there's, am I a good teacher? Am I the union rep? Am I the department chair? Like all of those pieces of identity play a role here, and we don't actually stop and deconstruct them. And so I like to think about
Also, in that is the identity that you bring with you, right? Like, are you a parent? What is your ethnicity? Where did I grow up? Like, all of that contributes to who we are individually and how we show up. So just kind of want to throw that in there.
No, I appreciate that, because I went into professional identity, but there's the personal identity there. They're all a nice mix of things. And I'm a big believer that, and I always say you can share as much as you want, or as safe as you feel about sharing. But I always model being not only authentic and vulnerable in who I am. And so when I start leading groups of people, I always start with myself. And I start to show them that, yes, you can trust me. And with trust, someone has to be honest first. And so I know that can be scary. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to be the honest one first, and we'll see who joins me. But what I've seen is, as we share our identities and we have an understanding of what makes us us, then it's a matter of building the us identity, right? So if I'm this person and I bring all of these levels of layers and complexities, then what makes us us? What is uniting us here? Right. So we can actually say we're both educators. Okay, that's one shared identity. And so as we start thinking about what are our shared identities here, and then what are the values behind our shared identities, that's how I start to think about how we forge a team. I like to forge teams in values, and I like to forge teams in strengths. And one of the biggest belief systems that I have is this notion of, I don't have a weakness if I'm in a group, because my weakness is your strength. And we're such a good team that your strength is going to teach me, but is also going to be the one that takes the lead in this group when that is necessary. And then at some point, I'm going to have a strength that you don't have, and I get to use it in service of the group. And so to get a group to understand each other and know each other that well, and to be able to wield and yield your power and privilege in a group, takes, again, a lot of intentional design, and also safe feeling like I don't have to be in control or in power here, because I trust the team to do this. Um, One of the examples that I wanted to share with you, Dr. Jag, and it's actually my favorite one, and if I can get my new group to do this, I would love it. But I led a group of educators as a principal. They were all interventionists. They were all in some way, shape, or form providing smaller group instruction, whether it was special education or a counselor or a psychologist. They were all working with smaller groups of children that needed deeper interventions, but they never talked to each other. They all kind of did their work and they went to their office or their classroom. They had their own schedule. They never sat down and talked about strategies or how they could make themselves stronger. And so I brought this team together, and it was about a significant amount, about 18 people. And one of the things that we did was we got to really learn ourselves and our strengths. And then it was a lot of leveraging strengths across. Now, I had the privilege to know all of them, right? So I would say things like, "Oh, Joe, what you can help Sylvia do with this student would be beautiful. Can you connect about this student, and I'll talk to you about it next week? And then it was a lot of like holding people accountable, to do that, but in a beautiful way, until I saw that the group saw themselves as a group and saying, yes, you're right, Joe knows how to do this and I don't, and I'm going to learn from Joe, and vice versa. But when I knew we had arrived is when we were discussing one particular student that we were having a really hard time reaching, like really hard time. Like I was actually all out of like I was like emptying out all my whole toolbox. I'm like, I've tried everything and we're still not reaching this child. And we were disagreeing about a lot of things. And so I remember being in the room with all 18 folks and I said, there's a lot of conflict in this room. I want us to stand up and go to the person we have conflict with. And they looked at me with big eyes, right? And so, yeah, and so I stood up and I walked over to the person I had the most conflict with. And I said, "Please stand up. We're going to talk about this." And then it was like, "Oh, okay, we can do this. This is safe." And it was just really funny to see the trepidation. But what ended up happening is that became a way that we actually addressed conflict in the room. And it wasn't at first I was the one calling it, but I loved when they started calling it. They would be like, "Fabi, there's conflict in this room. We need to deal with it before we move on. Can we all stand up and go to the person we're having conflict with?" And the level of discourse and conversations and understanding that the conflict was about the work and it wasn't about the people. And it was about we're disagreeing on how to do this, and we need to be able to be connected or think about other people's ideas at the same time. And how safe is it to say, I have conflict with you, and then an hour later, I'm going to go have lunch with you, and and still be okay as colleagues. And I think that that takes just an extraordinary level of psychological safety of knowing that the group won't ostracize me, won't reject me, if I have a disagreement. And I actually think that that's the responsibility of the facilitator. There's always a facilitator of the group. There's always a person that's in charge of the group. As much as I hate hierarchy, it is always there. And I think about the deep responsibility that that person has to start setting the conditions, but then to also release that responsibility to the group to share the power so that someone else can say that and someone else can pose the questions.
One thing I noticed about your example is that you modeled, right? So you modeled the
Mhm.
behavior that you wanted them to practice. Another thing is
Mhm.
when I think about psychological safety, I think about emotional intelligence. And that also goes especially for the leader of the group, right? The person who's actually
Mhm.
putting these structures together, holding this space for people to have these conversations and to kind of forge through some of the disagreements or misunderstanding or whatever elephant is in the room to really address it takes a lot
Yes.
of emotional intelligence and building the
Yes.
emotional intelligence of the team as well and having them practice
Mhm.
that. So I think that's extremely powerful. But also, I just want to hit for our viewers is really thinking about the space, because what you did
Mhm.
was hold the space for them to have those conversations and created kind of
Mhm.
a container around what that looked like with your modeling. And I think with that
Yes.
consistency, that helps teams to then become closer, right? Brene
Mhm.
Brown often talks about the sliding door and how we become
Mhm.
closer and how we actually, by not ignoring the challenges or the elephant that's in the room, we actually address it in a way that kind of, moves towards the same direction. Then we're all a stronger team and you can do so much more
Yes.
powerful work. And in the work of equity, that when you're addressing systemic racism, when you're addressing homophobia in schools, or when you're
Mhm.
in among staff in the community,
Mhm.
right, when you're in this deep like work, we have to have teams that are ready to push forward. But there always going to be something that comes up that pushes against the values or pushes against kind of the traditional way in which our systems function, because sometimes people
Yes.
want to make change but they
Yes.
haven't seen it. And so then for
Yes.
us to be able to imagine or reimagine what that looks like, we have to be able to come together and talk about those things that are really
I
important.
have two examples, two very recent examples actually of what you discussed. So I'm in the process of forging some new teams right now. Like I'm neck deep in creating new teams. And again, I know it's intentional design. So one team has been meeting together for 2 years, and they're very frustrated with the district. Very frustrated. And it's an issue of equity for special education students. And by the way, they're right. Okay. So I'm trying to build with them. I'm trying to build with them to have the outcomes that they're seeking. But I also know we need to design. And so I was invited to join them at their meeting. And it was a large group of people. I want to say about 20, 24 people. And I said to them, I said, I suggest that we form a different group. I suggest that we start all over. I suggest that we take on a new role, call it a different name. And they just, and I said, and we have to figure out how we honor the work that you've led, but also transform it to now, because now we're in a different space than 2 years ago. And they didn't want to. They said, oh, but we've already been meeting. We have all these agendas. And so I said, okay. So in my mind, I thought, what's my intervention here, right? Like, what is going to be my intervention for this group? Because I'm a big believer in, if you're a facilitator or a leader, there's a conversation that group needs to have at that moment. And, how are they going to have it? And I decided that I had to be really vulnerable. And so I said, can I tell you my biggest fear about that decision? And when I said that, I noticed computers close, pencils were down, they leaned in with their body language, and I had them all ears. And I said, you haven't gone anywhere in 2 years. You're extremely frustrated with the district. I am now coming in representing the district, and you're going to fight me the entire time, even though I come here to be an ally. And it's not going to be pleasant for either one of us. And I think this is actually really fun work. And we both want the same things. So that's what I'm afraid of. And our interactions are going to get in the way of prior projections of power, and we're not going to be able to accomplish this task. And then I stopped talking, and then they all said, okay, new group. And they're like, you're right. Like, "Right, you're right. We're gonna be mad at you all the time." And I said, right, you just met me. I just got here. So it was a really funny sort of space. But what I appreciated was people don't talk to you like that. They don't tell you, let me tell you what I'm afraid of. So that's one. Another one is, again, with a very new group. And I'm a big believer that you just say, here's the elephant in the room, or here's the interaction. So there was an invitation. This is a new group. There was an invitation by one person who was noticing an issue of equity. And she was being very polite about it, but she kept pointing it out. And because she's a woman, and because she's a woman of color, it was overlooked by the group every time. And so by the third time of her attempt, I actually said, okay, I need to intervene. There's been an invitation 3 times by one of our colleagues to take up the space to discuss this. What is it about that topic that we're avoiding as a group? And that makes people really uncomfortable. And so and again, when I get silence from that's when I model and I say, here's my theory around this. But I don't know, it's just a theory, and I like invite other voices. But that's what people don't want to do when they're forging teams, is they're too uncomfortable to have the real conversation, or we're moving really fast towards an agenda because we all have meetings within the next 30 minutes. And so are we really going to take the time to truly have meaningful dialogue and engage in true psychological safety of groups? Or are we going to fall prey to our to-do list? So one of the things that I've been saying across this whole year is our to be is greater than our to-do list. I am more interested in how you be than what you do. And I'm looking at how you do what you do. If you want to know what I'm looking for, I'm looking at that. How are we being? And so that's those are two examples that came up with what you said.
And it's interesting when you talk about the importance of how like how you be versus what you do or how you do, is because in order to get to the work, the action, you have to figure out how you're actually going to work together to do the work, right? And so, for example, I love like liberatory design, I love equity conscious design, like inquiry, all of that, in terms of like how do we actually redesign systems in a way that we're dismantling inequities completely, right? And you know, I'm more radical, you and I both, in terms of sometimes you just got to tear the whole thing down, right? But even when you tear it down, who's the team that's actually going to rebuild the work in a way that's, you know, really focused on students or community or whatever organization you're a part of? So what I found important about what you said is that's where we actually lose people, and we don't actually move towards true systemic change because the team that's leading it isn't focused on how they're going to be together. And I know a lot of organizations, and me included, in terms of the work of equity, there's a lot of urgency. We have to get it done right now. We have to change, you know, the way we, you know, instruction. We have to change our curriculum. We have to do all these things. If when we go slow to go fast, it is so much better, right? Because we're forging together, we're thinking together about how are we going to actually redesign this in a way that's effective. But before we can redesign, we have to talk about our individual identities. What am I bringing to the room right now, right? As a Black woman, as a person who grew up not very rich, I grew up in Oakland, California. I've seen some community violence. Like I've had these experiences. I've been a teenage mom, you know, like all of these experiences shape who I am today in my professional work as well. So for people to hear that, the people that I'm leading, and for me to hear their stories, and then we come up with a collective identity about like how are we going to be together in order to really move this work is so crucial. And
Yes.
what are your thoughts about that? And then also, how do you help people slow down?
Well, I like there's all sorts of thoughts that came to my head. The first one, and you've heard me say this because it's one of my favorite quotes. And I want to say it's Jim Knight. He says the success of an intervention has more to do with the internal condition of the intervener than the intervention itself. So we can come up with all sorts of interventions for education, but if we don't take care of the intervener's inner, like knowledge and knowing and feelings about it, it doesn't matter. And I will say we have the longitudinal data in education that it hasn't mattered. Like I actually, one of the things that I have in my office is a big sign that says, I'm not here to do what's been done before. And we have short term memory because we've tried to do so many things, all in urgency, all like, if they can't read, we need to do literacy. They can't do that. And it's always rooted in a couple of things. It's always rooted in ignorance, meaning when we design professional learning for adults, for educators, our story is that they don't know. So if only they knew, they would do different. And I think that's being rooted in ignorance. And I'm thinking, do you know how many degrees educators have? It's not a knowing thing. I think we should be rooting our professional learning in responsibility and the collective responsibility that we have when we sign that contract to be an educator. So that's one big difference. The second big difference is we don't take care enough of our adults. We say that we're about the kids and it's all about the kids, and then we railroad through the adults and we change data for a group of students for one particular cohort. And then the next year, we're right back where we started because we were only looking at student outcomes. We should be really thinking about the collective responsibility that we have and the structures of support in order to be able to help me as a teacher be able to reach all of my students. So those are two very big and different notions, and also this notion of urgency. And I'm going to get a little bit critical here. Urgency is a culture of white supremacy, and our whole school day is rooted in urgency, right? I have grade levels, it's all dictated by time and age groups. There's a bell that reminds me that I'm supposed to do something else. I'm supposed to stop my cognitive development here and go to a different subject area. Like we're just rooted in this level of urgency that hasn't served us. As a matter of fact, when I first got to this district, people were calling and texting me on Sunday at 7 a.m. I believe I responded with, can you go play with your kids? Like right now, you're not going to change anything. What you're doing at 7 a.m. on Sunday is stressing yourself out. It's not going to change the outcomes. And so, this notion of slowing down, thinking about who we are, thinking about how we're going to do this together, and what are the systems of support that are necessary for us to do that is one big piece. The other big piece that we're actually spotlighting on, and I'm using the word spotlight very carefully here, we took a look at the 15% of our students that we haven't reached for whatever reason, all of them. And what we did was we said, well, we have this amount of students that we haven't been able to reach. And as we're doing street data versions, right, like going in and figuring out who these kids are and what they need, I looked at our prior initiatives and they were all very heavy literacy based. And so here's this like disconnect. These children, we have a chronic absenteeism issue and we're giving more literacy to the school. But if the kids aren't there, then who cares about your literacy initiative? And as we look at, and actually, so here's something that actually broke my heart. So we're doing empathy interviews with homeless students that are chronically absent. And the theme across this is the one adult that welcomes them with love. That's what gets them to come to school. They all had different variations of that answer, but ultimately what those children were telling us was, I have one adult that's really happy to see me and that changes, me coming. So again, as a school district, we can say, here's a literacy initiative and this that won't help this child. And so this notion of how do we see our children? How do we love children? How do we see their strengths? And then also for the adults, do you know my strengths as a teacher? And are you able to then honor my strengths, but also help me when I can't reach children? And do I have a support group? Is there collective efficacy there? So these are all very different notions, but I think they're necessary notions. And then the last piece is because I just finished reading an article that talked about our short term memory and long term memory loss in education. We keep recycling the same ideas over and over again. And when you look at big districts, there's a 1 or 2% growth. That's it. And so I always think about like, so the $90 million that we spent on these initiatives, were they worth the 1%, the 2%? Is that how we want to spend our money? Is that what taxpayers are expecting us to do with the responsibility that we have over their funds, or is it to go directly to school sites to have supports before and after school to be able to listen to children to give them what they're saying that they need and what they would love for school to be? So I'm in this space of trying to not do the same thing again. And I will tell you though, sometimes I'm seen, as I'm a little crazy, but it's okay. I'll take that.
I've been seen in my career as a little crazy quite a few times, especially when you are rethinking how people do their work, right? Because it hasn't worked in education the way we've done it for African American, Latino, Indigenous groups of children. So we have to think differently.